Good afternoon, students. The next topic is pollen-pistil interaction. So we get two words, that is pollen and pistil, correct? Isn't it? Pollen is pollen grain coming from the anther and pistil is gynoecium containing style, stigma and ovary. So there is an interaction of the pollen grain on the stigma of the gynoecium. Now, in this pollen-pistil interaction, first the pollen grain gets deposited on the stigma of the flower and leads to the formation of a long pollen tube through the germapore. You know very well, whenever the cytoplasm volume increases, the intine ruptures from the germapore and it leads to the formation of a pollen tube. Now, the content of the pollen grain will definitely enter into the pollen tube. What content? That is the male gamete and the cytoplasm will enter into the pollen tube. Correct? Okay. Once the pollen tube is ready, now the pollen tube will start growing. It will pass through the tissues of the stigma. It will pass through the entire length of the style and finally will reach to the ovary. Once the pollen tube reaches towards the ovary, that is at the micropylar end, one of the synergid cell having filiform apparatus will provide a proper direction and a passage for the entry of the pollen tube towards the ovary. Right? Okay, this is generally an entire mechanism which generally involves first deposition of the pollen grain on the stigma of the flower, then there is the formation of a pollen tube. It will pass through the entire length of the style and will enter through the micropyle into the ovary. This interaction starting from the deposition of the pollen grain on the stigma and the entry of the pollen tube towards the ovary is called as pollen-pistil interaction. Now what happens in this pollen-pistil interaction is that you can say that the ability or the tendency of this pistil, which is nothing but gynoecium, right, to identify or to recognize the pollen grain is due to the stimulation of the chemical. That means that the ability of the gynoecium or the pistil to recognize the pollen grain is due to the secretion of a chemical from the pollen grain. We know very well that the exine of the pollen grain is generally made up of a chemical component called as sporopollenin. That plays an important role in recognizing the pollen grain for the gynoecium. This process is called as pollen-pistil interaction, where the pollen grain will get deposited on the stigma of the flower. It will develop a long pollen tube. Pollen tube will start traveling from the stigma to the entire length of the style and finally will enter through the micropylar end into the ovary. So this mechanism is generally called as pollen-pistil interaction. Thank you.